physically, but I'm very happy to present the findings from our global survey of language teachers and language learners coping with the transition to emergency remote instruction. So this was a study that we carried out between April and September of this year, involving over 6,000 participants from 118 countries. And in this presentation, I will be focusing on language teachers and learners, as well as instructors and majors in linguistics, TESOL, modern languages, and related fields. For that purpose, we used a custom-made questionnaire involving 435 items, looking at different variables that we thought were affecting the teachers' coping with the transition. So the constructs we were looking at were some background variables such as age, experience, then all attitudes and experiences related to remote instruction, well-being, which is also a prominent topic in this conference. And then a battery of psychological instruments focusing on 21 constructs that we identified as potentially relevant, and then also some dynamic constructs, because part of this study involved a longitudinal survey where we were following up with a second questionnaire to those participants who agreed to take part in that. So here you can see a breakdown of the population, because the questionnaire was available in 2 languages, in Polish and in English. You have the breakdown by the populations here, and interestingly, you can see that in the version for Polish-speaking participants, the completion rates were much lower than for the rest of the world, which in itself is an interesting finding. But overall, the average completion rate was around 31%, which is not bad for a questionnaire of this length. So here are the locations of the respondents. You can see that there were quite a few in Japan as well. Most of them, though, oh, I'm sorry, why did it happen like that? Okay, most of them, though, were located in the English-speaking countries, and then beyond that, predominantly Europe, but the rest of the world got a fair representation as well. Some countries did not provide responses because they were either difficult to reach or because there was no remote instruction taking place online. But if there was any remote teaching, then it was taking place via other channels, and that was not our focus of interest. Some demographic information. The gender distribution is probably something that would be expected, quite a big age span, and also quite varied teaching experience. And what's important in this context is that a quarter of the instructors were not teaching in their home country, and also almost a quarter had students who were residing in different time zones during the pandemic. So here you can see the breakdown of the schools represented. This will turn out to be influential in the patterns later on. And in terms of the language levels taught, you find a distribution that's probably not very surprising either, with fewer and fewer teaching at higher levels of proficiency. The teaching methods employed in around 2/3 of the cases involved synchronous communication, and then in others it was a medley of different asynchronous approaches, and this also influenced coping with the situation. So in the first stage we looked at the behaviors and responses of the participants, and using a cluster analysis we were able to distinguish two cohorts of better and worse coping instructors. And then we looked at the variables that distinguished between those two groups. So let us first look at what distinguished the better coping teachers. They were predominantly teaching at higher levels of education, so mainly college, university, and 90% were teaching in real time. Most of them found that they were equally efficient with this mode of delivery. They declared that they were well prepared and well supported in the transition. They were fairly happy with the learning management systems that they were using. And they declared that their students were also coping quite well. They also didn't experience too many logistic problems and maintained an overall positive work and life attitude. In contrast, the group of the worst coping instructors were, for the main part, teaching at lower levels of education, so typically through kindergarten through high school. And here, only a little more than 1/3 of the teachers were teaching in real time. The vast majority declared that they found their teaching to be much less efficient than the time of face-to-face instruction prior to the pandemic, and they found themselves to be less productive to a larger extent than the better coping teachers. And also a lower number thought that they were coping at least as well as others were. Now, if you look further and if you wanted to analyze the correlations, then this would be actually quite difficult, because if you wanted to zoom in, then this is not really very legible. So we took a different approach. That is, we looked at the Likert scale items and the correlations above 0.3, and instead we applied a network visualization. And here you can see that now we are able to distinguish easily identifiable clusters that are also easy to interpret. So on the left, you have the giant component of four constructs representing self-regulation, engagement or openness, positive orientation, and social skills and contacts. And these constructs are characterized by a positive valence. And then on the right-hand side periphery, you have three constructs that were evaluated as negative in the participants' responses, and those were mainly to do with a family relationship and work-home balance, future expectations concerning stability, and remote teaching-related attitudes and experiences. So what transpires from these findings is that the most influential variables are self-regulation, openness, engagement, positive orientation, and extraversion, of which positive orientation was the most central component. And extraversion was less connected to, for instance, teaching-related experiences and attitudes, although it was still there. So wrapping up the teacher part, we can see that the transition was difficult, especially for those teachers who were teaching at lower levels of education. They felt less prepared and more disengaged. In terms of the patterns of behaviors, you can see the influence of the logistics and also the declared lack of physical presence and contact and interaction in class, which was to a large extent connected to the medium, or whether it was synchronous or asynchronous. And the findings also emphasize the importance of training, both on the job training and pre-service training and just-in-time training, as in this case, and also the importance of initial convictions and confidence, because those bore on the final performance. Institutional backing is, of course, important in these cases, and also given the fact that on average the teachers declared that preparing one remote class took 49% more time than a face-to-face class. This is something that administrators ought to take into account, given that we still only have 24 hours. And it's also quite important to be aware of the positive life work attitudes and being kind to oneself, and to permit oneself to be experiencing the different range of emotions. So what does the receiving end of language teaching online look like? Here we looked at language learners, and I'll briefly focus on some of the correlations and then look at the bigger picture again. So here we can see that the financial aspect was important. That determines whether you're able to afford the hardware, software, and bandwidth. It highlights the importance of motivation and engagement. Those students who were invested kept their motivation levels throughout the teaching process. The importance of the user friendliness of the teaching platform, and motivation that was already mentioned. Then how did the students evaluate their language teachers? Well, the language teachers were judged as better coping when they were thought to be enthusiastic, a warm personality, and to be caring about their students, especially during this difficult time. And the effectiveness of online learning was influenced by worry about the way the performance would be assessed, and whether the teacher was or was not able to meet the students' individual or special needs. Isolation from classmates, of course, also influenced productivity, and the ability to be kind to oneself was able to depress stress. There were a few other correlations that were there, but I'd like to focus on the bigger picture. So again, we were able to carry out a cluster analysis that distinguished two groups of better and worse coping learners. And I'll focus now on the distinguishing features. So unlike in the case of teachers, where one of the dominant factors distinguishing the better and the worse coping instructors was whether they were teaching synchronously or asynchronously, here almost all the language learners were taking part in real-time classes. The aspects that distinguished the better and worse coping learners were motivation, both general and staying focused and motivated in class, engagement in the learning process, difficulties with staying focused, concerns regarding assessment, the ability of the teacher to meet individual or special needs of the learners, initial confidence in the ability to learn remotely, just as in the case of teachers, general attitudes towards distance instruction and interaction with the teacher and the classmates. As before, we looked at whether we could distinguish clusters of items, and here again we were able to do so. You can see that in this case the concentration is much higher than in the case of teachers, and we can identify four major clusters concentrated around social contacts, the motivation and the organization potential and capability of the learners, negative aspects and challenges of the situation, and positive aspects or affordances of the pandemic. Here the main hubs or the centers of the clusters center around psychological constructs and a few other variables such as love of learning, organization, competence, ambition, perseverance, willpower, optimism, creativity, curiosity, perceived stress level, and flexibility. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the participants who filled out the questionnaire. It was not the shortest questionnaire out there. It would typically take from 25 to upwards of 45 minutes to fill out. Thank you very much for your attention. Domo arigatou gozaimashita. And I'll be very happy to take any comments, questions, criticism. If you're interested in reading up on more findings, then the first paper out of the project is available both on Academia and ResearchGate, and then we have several more in the pipeline, and we'll be announcing them both on those two repositories and on the project website. So thank you very much once again. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll be happy to take and field any questions, comments, criticism. Thank you.